So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today for our webinar, Anatomy of a Client Phone Call. And I'd like to introduce Kristi Lehman. Kristi Lehman is the Vice President of MinPets and is a licensed social worker. She has been doing veterinary social work for 8 years and has been with Minnesota Pets for 7 years. She's excited to be here to share her knowledge and supporting clients through the euthanasia experience and how to take care of your own well-being through the process as well. So I'll hand it over to you, Kristi.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. So if anything happens with my audio or video or anything, just let me know, but I'll just kick things off. So we are focusing on the client phone calls that you'd be taking. And I realize that the phone calls you take in your clinics are very different than the types of phone calls in the setting that we have. So I'm going to keep that in mind, and I'm going to have some caveats, but I'm going to share what we've learned here at Minnesota Pets. First, I just want to, let's see here. All right, let me get the hang of this. All right, so I just wanted to outline a little bit about who we are. We, as Sarah said, I'm from Minnesota Pets, and many of you have probably heard of us at Minnesota Pets. We're an in-home euthanasia practice here in the Twin Cities, and we have a doctor in Duluth as well. We've been around for a little over 10 years, and we specifically provide in-home euthanasia and also transportation and cremation care for deceased pets, and we partner with VHA for cremation. So we are just completely end-of-life services. When we're not in COVID times, we also provide in-home quality of life consults. Those are just on hold right now. So we have doctors available 7 days a week, and our team here in Oakdale schedules those visits. But some of you may not know, we also have a sister company, or sort of a branch of Minnesota Pets. In 2016, Dr. Rebecca McComas and I kind of branched into a different type of company made up of our phone team. Our phone team schedules visits for Minnesota Pets, of course, our kind of home base headquarters practice here, but we also schedule end-of-life visits for practices all over the country and into Canada as well. So our team manages the client communication, client records, administrative tasks for those practices. Most of them are smaller in-home euthanasia practices as well, solo doctors often who can't take all of their own phone calls and see visits. So we help them with that. And we're an interdisciplinary team. We have CVTs, vet assistants, human service professionals, and just a miscellaneous crew of wonderful people who help our clients over the phone. So in 2020, our team scheduled 19,000 end-of-life visits, and we took 97,000 phone calls, which is kind of hard to believe. And it was a very busy year because of COVID specifically. And we have a team right now of about 15 people on the phone. So we know a little bit about taking phone calls and helping clients over the phone. And a lot of it we have just learned along the way, and I've infused a lot of it with what we talk about a lot in the social work field. And so I wanted to share some of that with you today so that you could kind of put some of these things hopefully into place in your own practices. And as I go through everything, please feel free to chat questions or comments or examples or anything like that. I'm going to go through this. It's always hard with these virtual webinars because I'm just talking to a screen, just with myself, but I know you're all out there, and if you have questions, please feel free to stop and we can cover those things, and hopefully there will be some time at the end as well. So today we're going to focus on the anatomy of a client phone call. So we'll talk about why phone calls are important, how they typically go, or the different kind of components of a client phone call, and how you can, do your best for the client at each step. And then we'll talk a little bit about some common challenges and opportunities, especially things that you might be experiencing in the clinic right now. So I feel like this is a tricky topic for our webinar only because I can't see any of you in the audience. And so I know some of you are probably veterinarians, some might be vet techs, we might have some receptionists and managers. So different parts of what I go through will hopefully be relevant for different people in different positions, but hopefully these are some things that you can bring back to your team and kind of share with each other. So another thing I want to mention is that we of course have the most experience talking to clients about end-of-life visits, And I realize that you take a lot of phone calls in your clinic, and not all of them are end of life visit scheduling questions and things like that, of course. So a lot of what we talk about will kind of gear toward end of life phone calls. But I also want you to kind of think about some of the things that we talk about in terms of just difficult calls, or clients who call in for different things that are difficult for them to talk about, even if it's not necessarily euthanasia, and also just phone calls in general, even just your run-of-the-mill nail trims and things like that. So I'm hoping it feels relevant for all of you. So from a veterinary team's perspective, and from a practice's or a practice owner's perspective, phone calls, of course, are necessary. Every practice has to have a phone system and take incoming calls. Even with, the internet and email and texting, clients still, pick up the phone to call with questions. So of course, it's very important. If we don't get any phone calls, we don't get any visits, there's no revenue. So phone calls are a lifeline really for a lot of practices. And also phone calls are the first step of a successful appointment. I really want, if there's one thing to kind of take away from this talk today, I want you to think about the phone call, not as just, a necessity that we have to get through to get to the visit, or, to get to the important part of the interaction. It is the important part of the interaction. It's where it starts. It's the first impression. It sets the rest of the interactions up for success. So I really want to make that part clear, because I do feel like a lot of times we think of the phone call as just, something we have to go through, and the phones are ringing. It's no one's favorite part. And so I really want everyone to kind of walk away with some focus on the phone call and how to make them better. We also know that phone calls are stressful. Phone calls are really associated with job stress. There's a study in 2007 that showed that that was one of the most stressful parts, especially for veterinarians, and especially around setting boundaries, having to take calls when you're trying to squeeze them in between visits. So we know it's not an easy part of the work that we do. And we also know from research previously that many veterinary teams don't feel equipped to provide client support. It's not often something that we're taught, in school, in vet tech school or veterinary school. And so a lot of what we are trying to do each day is just, doing our best without that formal education about how to do it. And that's really hard. That's a difficult position to be in. And it can cause burnout. It can cause just overall stress. And so I'm hoping that some of the things we go through today help the clients, of course, but also really help you feel good about the phone calls that you're taking, and feel good about, doing this every day. And we also know that veterinary clinics are not really conducive to good phone calls. It's not private, it's loud, it's busy. I know it's difficult to carve out that time and have those phone calls. So we'll talk a little bit about that at first, or later on in the talk. But I did want to just first address that these are hard things, and it is very normal to hang up a phone call with a client and just think, oh, I could have done that better, and I don't feel like that went well, or this is not my favorite part of my job or my day. That is totally normal, and it's okay. Hopefully we can make them a little bit easier for you, but you're definitely not alone if you struggle with phone calls or dread them sometimes. So from a client's perspective, especially when it comes to end of life calls, making that phone call really makes things feel real. Usually many weeks or days or hours of conversations between the family and just going back and forth and putting it off, that all builds up and leads to that one phone call. So each person that you speak to, each time you pick up the phone for an end of life call, it's like the tip of the iceberg. So much went into that. And it often is the moment where it just goes from something the client's been thinking about to something that is going to happen, which is really, really hard for them. And it makes that phone call just even more important to help them through. Most clients don't know what to expect. I would say this is true for a lot of types of visits that they schedule, but especially for end of life visits. A lot of clients just don't even know where to start. They don't know if you require medical records, if you require exams, if you require, diagnostics first, if they have to talk to the veterinarian before they can schedule. Those things that we take for granted as just a normal part of the euthanasia process or end of life, scheduling process. It's all new to them. So we really can't be, clear enough for them. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. Clients are also really benefiting from that validation and guidance during that phone call. They're calling for concrete help. And even if you're not able to help them with a visit for whatever reason, and we'll talk about this some more too, you can still validate and empathize with them. That really goes a long way for them. And like I said earlier, that phone call really paves the way for a successful visit, especially, if you're a receptionist and you're scheduling a visit and you're setting it up for another person on your team to kind of take it from there when the client comes in. It's a really important part of that continuum of care. So it's good to kind of set it up so that the rest of the interactions go smoothly. And the phone call is really an extension of the visit. It's very crucial, and it's an important part of the overall service delivery and the client's takeaway and their relationship with your clinic after. So it is really important, both from a practice perspective and a client perspective. So with the anatomy of a client phone call, these are some of the components that I kind of will break down and get into. There's the preparation part of the phone call, connection, exploration, logistics, and conclusion. So with that being said, we all want phone calls to kind of go this way. It would be so much easier if we knew that each phone call, we start by saying this, and the client says this, and then we say this, and that's the phone call. But we know that in reality, phone calls usually tend to go like this. And just when you think that you've heard it all, you take a call and it's something very, very different than you've ever dealt with before. So we encounter this very often here at DBM Center. And so I know this is the truth. And so even though I broke it down in sort of a linear kind of pattern in terms of the phone call component, I also realize it doesn't always go that way. These are just the big parts of the phone call to focus on. It can go in any order, and sometimes it just totally goes off the rails no matter what we try to do. So I do recognize that for sure. So when we talk about the preparation piece of the phone call, these are things that we want to put some thought into even before the client calls us, even before we answer the phone. These are things that help set the phone call up. So the phone call sets up the visit for success, and these things can set up that phone call for success. This really comes down to making sure the client can find some information on their own without having to pick up the phone and call if they're not ready to or if they don't quite want to yet. And that really comes down a lot to your website. So some of the things that you want to have on your website would be, services offered and common pricing. I know that's not always feasible for a clinic because you offer very different services and a lot of services. And so I realize that's not typically common, but especially with end-of-life services, it might be something to consider to at least list that out, and maybe even having a separate part of your website where you talk more in detail about end-of-life visits. Clients want to know that information. It's part of their planning process, and so giving them that on your website makes it a little bit easier for them, and it makes that phone call a little easier as well. It is a good idea to have your COVID protocols on your website. If you don't yet, that's especially important for end-of-life visits. It can be helpful to have a visit request form. I have a little picture here of what our Minnesota Pets request form looks like, and this kind of feeds directly into our medical record system, but it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It's just a good way for clients to have an alternative way of reaching out to you if they're not ready to make a call, or if they are at work and they know if they call, they'll break down and it will make the day difficult to get through. So giving them an opportunity to reach out to you, not over the phone, is helpful when possible. And I would say with those forms, give some really good thought to what needs to be on there in order to give the client information. Like if they're an existing client, or, if you have other sort of deal breakers at Minnesota Pets, we call them deal breakers, but that's not quite the right term. It's just more for us, are they in our service area? Is it a size pet that we're able to help with, or do we have to send an assistant? Those kind of really important pieces of information that we need to know early, we put those in our request form so that there doesn't have to be a lot of extra back and forth when the client just wants some information. Of course, make sure you have your location, hours, and contact information. And then also consider having some educational or decision-making support resources available on your website. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but things like quality of life scales, articles about knowing when it's time, blog posts written by your staff, You can certainly feel free to link to any of our articles on our website about making the decision. This is helpful for those clients who want to kind of navigate this a little bit more independently and get that information, but it's also helpful for your staff because when they're on the phone having those conversations, they have somewhere to direct clients to after the phone call. So that's really helpful to have. It's also good to have, especially if you have a blog section of your website, to have an article about what to expect at the visit, at the euthanasia visit. This is something that you can tell clients about when you're scheduling it, that they can get all of that information online if they would like. Some clients want that very detailed information about what to expect. Some clients don't want that. So having it available is really helpful. It's also good if you can have some expectations, especially right now. I know a lot of us are feeling really crunched because of COVID. And if your team is feeling like clients are waiting on hold more or reaching voicemails more, or you're booked out, farther than typical, try to think of ways that you can let clients know that even before you connect with them over the phone, just to sort of set those expectations. For example, at DVM Center, if we have a doctor who's on vacation for a couple of days, we'll try to put that in our voicemail or our on hold message. So we're still available to talk with them, but at least they know right away that that's sort of what we're looking at, and they can choose to stay and talk to us, of course, or they can hang up and kind of go down their list of phone numbers. If anyone else has anything that you have on your website that you have found really helpful, feel free to share in the chat as well. But these are some of the things that we look for with the practices we work with. And these are some of the most common questions. And I think that's a really good way to think about it, to get together with your team, the people who answer the phone, and say, what do clients most often ask in that phone call? And see if you can give them that answer before they even have to pick up the phone and call. Another really important component of the phone call is connection. This is probably the most important component, and I think it also can be the most difficult, especially in the settings that you're all working in and busy clinics and places that really make it tougher to have a connection with a client. I would say the most important part of making a connection is just being present, which seems very easy, but I know it's really hard, especially in the clinic setting. So just sort of finding ways to tune out the outside noise or that sort of thing, trying not to multitask when you're on those phone calls is really important. If you have a headset, we have these headsets that really kind of block out the rest of the sound, and that is helpful, especially when we're in the office and we can kind of overhear each other. That is all really helpful. So think of ways to really just stay present, even if it just means for a second turning away from your computer and taking a breath as you have that phone call and not looking at your screen or your email. It's also really important to acknowledge the difficulty of that call, and also remember that even if someone's calling and it's not for a euthanasia or it's not for a terminal kind of diagnosis visit, it might still be very difficult for them. For example, if someone has a dog that has been very itchy, for any of you who have your own pets and you've had itchy pets, I know I have, and they're up all night and they're itching, it's just exhausting and it's terrible to see them that way. So an itchy dog phone call might seem pretty run of the mill and, of course not terminal, but that client is still kind of going through a difficult thing. And so acknowledging it, and I have some sentences here over on the side, it's just easy to say that at the very beginning of the call, and it goes a long way. At Minnesota Pets, usually when I answer a call, the first thing I say is, I'm so sorry that you're having to make this call. And then we kind of talk about what the client is looking for. So I think that first acknowledgement is really important. Empathize every phone call or every visit, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, and then building rapport. And I know this is difficult. We don't have as much time as we want sometimes to have these long phone calls. And so I don't want you to think that rapport means, an hour-long phone call, really getting to know the client and, the depths of what they're going through. It really is just letting the client know, like, I'm here, I'm listening, I understand, and giving them a space to talk. It helps them, of course, have someone to talk to, but it also helps you make sure that you're getting them what they need, you're scheduling the right type of appointment, and you're setting it up for success. You're getting the information that you need for the rest of the interactions to go smoothly. And sometimes that does mean, taking a few extra minutes when possible. The last thing I'll say about that is how important it is to build your emotional vocabulary. And I will actually come back to that. I thought it was the next slide, but it's coming up in a second. So before I talk about that, let me just move my camera. I just want to dispel sort of a myth or a misconception that we can either be efficient or supportive, but that the two don't work well together. It's not true at all. Efficiency and compassion are friends. I think of it that way. They go hand in hand. Being compassionate means you're helping people efficiently, and you can be efficient while also being compassionate. I really want us to try to not make those two things mutually exclusive. And for some reason, I think a lot of us do just naturally. I know sometimes even at DVM Center, we have to catch ourselves and remember that we can be efficient and have a shorter phone call or a quicker phone call and still have given that client everything they need. It's beneficial for us and our energy levels and the practice, and it's also beneficial for the client. So when we think of supportive communication, there are two parts of that: instrumental support and nurturing support. Both are very, very important. Getting information, answering the client's questions, doing things for them, over the phone or at the visit, that's all super important. Really, that's what they're calling for, is for information and for you to take action for them. At the same time that you're doing those things, you can also be attending to their emotional needs and provide nurturing support. Those are the two components of supportive communication. So acknowledging feelings, validating, empathizing, all of that can be done simultaneously while you're taking care of the logistics of the visit or the phone call. So I just want you to remember those two things can go hand in hand, and in fact, they should go in hand in hand when you're making these difficult phone calls or having end-of-life decisions. So you're constantly in a balancing act. I know you have your time and energy, the client's emotional needs, and the practice's needs, and they seem to never be fully aligned or balanced out. It seems like whenever you have a phone call with a client who really, really needs some time or is really unsure of what to do, it's like they always happen to call when you don't have the time, or there's a lot going on, behind the scenes, behind you on the phone. It just seems like it always works that way. And I know that's really difficult and that can be really draining. And so I just want to acknowledge that it's normal to have these kind of conflicting balancing acts, and it doesn't always work out perfectly. And sometimes we do have to help the client in a more kind of succinct or efficient way, and a little less, fully rapport building and supportive. But there are some ways to be supportive and empathize that are kind of low effort and high impact. So we typically at DVM Center, we call these empathy statements, and these are really important to include in the phone calls that you take. So empathy statements are simply just phrases that convey to someone that you understand, that you're listening, you know what they're feeling, you know what they're going through, or at least you're trying to. It's really, really helpful to build this habit. A lot of us don't naturally have this habit. We don't speak this way, in our normal lives or outside of work or at work, and that's okay. That's very normal. Unless you, studied counseling in school, this might not be something that comes very natural. So it does take practice, and it's something that you can work into your personal life and your professional life. So strong empathy statements are low effort and high impact, like I mentioned before. It's just a statement you can make at different parts of the call that remind the client that you're here, you're listening, you understand. Even just saying, I understand how this feels, is really helpful for the client to hear. And I like to have this sort of feeling words list printed out at our office. We have these at our kind of cubicle areas. I think it's helpful to use phrases to kind of name the client's feelings. And so to say, this must be so frustrating, or you must be exhausted after going through this, or after being up all night with him, using feeling words names the client's feelings for them. And it's just a very, very impactful way for them to hear that the person they're talking to on the phone understands how they're feeling and what they're going through. This can be over the phone, but this can be, of course, in visits too. So I really, really encourage you to incorporate this into your interactions with clients. and your coworkers. It makes for a richer, more supportive communication overall. And I find that when we say these statements, it's sort of, we sometimes we fake it till we make it. We are on calls where we're distracted or we're just not, connecting with that client. And using these statements forces us to connect with them. It forces us to listen so that we can understand their emotion and name it. And it's just a really good way to kind of stay connected in that phone call and prevent some of that burnout that we feel when we're taking call after call with no connection. I think it's also helpful as part of your empathy statement or conversation to give the client permission. If someone cries over the phone, for example, they very often will apologize. And we often say, no apology necessary. It's okay to cry. This is a hard call to make. If someone's asking a lot of questions and they apologize, just saying it's okay to ask questions. That's what I'm here for. If someone is, confused, to say it's okay. This is really overwhelming. You can be feeling confused right now. There's a lot coming at you. So just naming how they're feeling and giving them permission to feel it can go a very long way. And I think, like I said, this is something that you can do over the phone and also in the visit. So we talk about empathy statements, and I know you're thinking, well, I take a lot of phone calls that aren't sad, which is good. And at Minnesota Pets, most of our phone calls happen to be sad. So that's our experience using empathy statements is typically in those settings. But I just want to remind you that you can really empathize with all emotions, not just sad ones. If someone's calling, they have a new puppy and they're scheduling their vaccinations, it's okay to empathize and say, like, you must be so excited, or congratulations, this is, really good news to hear. That you have a new family member. So even happy conversations can be a place where you can empathize. You can say, I have some examples here, but saying, I'm sure you're feeling so relieved right now. I'm sure you're taking such good care of her. I know this can be overwhelming. These are all empathy statements. You don't have to overthink them. It's just you naming that you understand what they're going through and that you are there, you're listening. And so I would challenge you to try to use at least one empathy statement at each call or visit. I know that might seem impossible, but I promise you can do it. And especially if you have some kind of go-to statements, there's nothing wrong with having go-to statements or sentences or sort of a script for your calls. I would imagine any of you who take calls quite often just naturally developed a script that you use. It doesn't make it less sincere. It just helps you remember to include everything you need to remember to include. And then these empathy statements can just be things that you add in. Like I said earlier, almost every call that I take when I'm on the phones for DVM Center, I start by saying, I'm so sorry that you're having to make this call. And yes, I say it, to every client, but yes, I truly feel it, for every client that calls. I really am sorry that they have to make that call. So including those empathy statements is really a good way to connect with those clients. So another component here of phone calls is exploration. No matter what you're scheduling, you typically have to get some information from clients, figure out what's going on, what they need from you, fill out their medical history, whatever level of information you need, for the visit or to schedule, you have to go through that over the phone. That the difficulty of that varies depending on why they're calling and what they need. Of course, sometimes this is a very quick part of the visit, but we found that when we're scheduling end of life visits, it really varies how much clients want to share. And sometimes they don't really want to share. They don't want to talk about it. They want to avoid, feeling emotional. Maybe they're at work. Maybe they just don't have a lot to say. They don't know what's going on with their pet. They just know it's time. I've talked to many people who just sort of grunt a little when I ask what's going on, and they just say, well, she's just old. And so sometimes clients just don't want to get into it. At the same time, I know, we have to have some information in order to schedule a visit and get the doctor to the client. So we encourage asking open-ended questions. So just getting them talking, what's changed recently? What led you to reach out? Have you tried anything so far? What is your goal for her? Those are good questions to kind of figure out where the client is in the decision-making process, what they might need from you, and what's going on with their pet. Explore history fully. This is really important, especially when we talk about end-of-life decisions and phone calls. Sometimes clients call and your gut feeling at first is this doesn't seem right, or this is a younger pet. And we always train our team here, just keep that gut feeling in check and kind of low level and keep going through the exploration part of the phone call. You might find the more you talk to the client that it makes perfect sense for them to be calling and for us to help with euthanasia, but we have to, fully listen to them in order to get to that part. Often our initial assessment does change with that additional information. And then also part of the exploration, I kind of think of it in a cycle, and I like to bring the exploration part of the phone call to a close in a way by affirming their decision. So once I've asked them, how did you arrive at this decision? What's been going on with your pet? They kind of, tell me all of those things. And then I usually say, gosh, based on what you're telling me, it sounds like you're calling at the right time. I support your decision. I can understand why you'd be concerned to see that, those sort of things. I think it's really important for them to hear that they're making the right call. And it's definitely okay to say that you support their decision. But if it's clear, if you really do support their decision, I think clients really need to know, that they're making that right choice. When it comes to these end of life conversations, so if clients call and they're scheduling a euthanasia or they're just calling because they're not quite sure, these end of life conversations are so valuable to them. I really hope, wherever you are in the setting of your practice, that you're able to help clients with these. But I know they are time intensive. And I know that because we're busy, sometimes we hesitate to even ask for details because we know I don't have time, to get into a 20-minute phone call right now. That is very understandable and very real. And even here at Minnesota Pet, sometimes I can see the calls coming in out of the corner of my eye while I'm on a longer call with clients. So that stress is very real. And I also just want to mention that these phone calls don't need to be long. We talked earlier about being compassionate and efficient, and that's really important. Human beings can only process so much information at once. So if you're giving the client some things to look for, you're asking some questions, you're giving them some resources, there's no reason that can't all happen in a 10-minute phone call. Very often, that happens here. And some of you might be thinking 10 minutes is way too long. And some of you might be thinking, there's no way I could fit all of that into 10 minutes. I would encourage you to give some thought to what you can do to prepare so that you can keep those phone calls on the shorter side while still giving the clients everything they need. So we talked earlier about having resources on your website. That's really good. And that's a good way that you can give the client homework, to say, we've talked about a lot, or, it sounds like you're on the right track. And I think you're calling at the right time. I think it's right to be considering this right now. We talked about the quality of life scale. Why don't you go on our website and take a look at that and sit down with your family and go through that and see what you decide or see what the score is. So using quality of life scales, articles on your website, resources that you have online, pain scales, that sort of thing, that's really helpful for the client to go through that. At the end of the day, I know sometimes clients want us to make the decision for them. It would be so much easier for them if we could, but of course, we can't. We can just give them the information that they need and support their decision. And so giving them the information is really helpful. And if you have a phone call that is kind of going in circles in that way, definitely try to redirect and give them that homework. And of course, if you're having a client who's really struggling, you can certainly refer them to us. Even if they don't schedule an end of life or an in-home euthanasia visit through Minnesota Pets, we'll still talk to them as long as they need on the phone and answer their questions and talk to them about their pet's quality of life. So you can always refer them for that reason. So another component, of course, is logistics. We talked a little bit about that before when we were talking about instrumental support and answering questions, scheduling, those sorts of things. Some of the ways that we can make the logistics component of the phone call softer and warmer and more supportive and less, like an interview, would be to be very personal, using the client and pet names right away, asking them at the beginning of the phone call. And instead of saying, he or she or your pet, using the pet's name when you're asking the rest of the questions. If your practice has any deal breakers, like I said, deal breakers for us would just be like if they're out of our service area or sort of it, but I would imagine for a clinic, if you're not letting people into the clinic, for example, if that's a deal breaker for the client, you'd want to assess that early on so that you don't get through the entire call and then disappoint them with, them not being able to get help from you. So I would encourage going through those things early. I would also try to decrease the opportunities that require your receptionist or you to make an on-the-fly decision during the call. So if there's anything that you can make available to your team that helps them be able to schedule visits or answer questions, have that available so that they don't need to put the client on hold or, call back, which of course, if they have to, it's okay. But the more they can get through in that initial phone call, the better for everyone involved. And then really think about if there are common barriers to scheduling and if there's anything that your clinic can change to reduce those barriers. So if you're finding that your receptionist team consistently has to check on something before they can schedule a certain type of visit, see if you can reduce that a little bit, if you can give some more direct parameters, if you can have some resource available for them to check while they're still on the phone. It's really helpful to get that information, like I said, all in that first phone call. It's helpful for the client. It reduces, communication from falling through the cracks. So really spend some time to kind of think through those things. And then, of course, remember to use empathy while covering logistics. That's very important. It's never an either or thing. It's always an and. So a couple of bonus logistics. These are things that we've implemented here at Minnesota Pets, and it's helped us a lot. I know it's not always possible depending on your software system and what you have available, but a couple of things that have been helpful would be sending a confirmation email after you schedule or cancel a visit. It just cuts down on a lot of confusion later on, and it gives the clients all of the information that they need. It also is a way for them to just review everything for accuracy. At Minnesota Pets, for example, the client's address is a very important part, and so we include that in the confirmation email. We don't want the doctor driving to the wrong place. So anything that is really important to catch, we put in the confirmation email. Also, because clients are just very emotional during that call, and sometimes I'm not sure if they're writing things down or if they'll remember what day the visit is on, and so putting that in the confirmation email helps a lot. We also send a same-day reminder email or a text would work too, just with gentle language, letting them know, the doctor's planning on seeing you today. I know it's a hard day. If you have any questions, feel free to call anytime. So those things we do through our software system, but you could have a template in your email or just have someone spend a few minutes at the beginning of the day sending those. It really helps a lot. And we have found that it cuts down on, mistakes or miscommunications or confusion. It's also really helpful for clients to give them a chance to prepay for their visit. This might seem counterintuitive because, we don't want to bring up payment too soon or seem too focused on it, but a lot of clients do prefer to take care of that so that when they come for their visit, they don't have to think about payment or paperwork. So we give them the chance to pay over the phone when they schedule or online, and they also fill their consent form out electronically if they would like to. So the vast majority of our clients do this, and I would encourage you to think about if it's possible at your practice. I mentioned this earlier, but having a what to expect article about your end of life services and then including that in the confirmation email or having it available on your website, that's really helpful because sometimes clients call and they schedule and they kind of want to know what to expect, but by then they're already just overwhelmed and those details are too much for them. So giving them that information is helpful, especially if it's a family or they have kids. Being able to describe to their family what will happen is helpful for them. It's also really important to make sure anyone who's answering your phones, any receptionists, anyone at your front desk, has experience with euthanasia and body care. So if a client asks a question, we really want them to be able to describe things in a way that makes sense and in an accurate way. And we want them to, understand what happens and goes on. So if you have anyone on your team that just hasn't had that experience maybe personally or professionally yet, make sure that they have a chance to be a part of those processes. At Minnesota Pets, we do ride-alongs when we're not in COVID times so that everyone can see what a visit goes, how it goes, what happens after, the cremation process. So we make sure to kind of see all aspects of it so everyone on the phone can say that they have done it and they describe it in a correct way. So the conclusion of the call, I'm just gonna make sure I'm doing okay on time. So the conclusion of the call is really important, especially when it comes to end of life conversations. The clients are sort of overwhelmed. They might feel all over the place a little bit. And so we want to sort of wrap it up for them in a way that is very organized and supportive and makes them feel like they have everything they need. So when you end the call, make sure you're communicating the plan. Sometimes it might be that you have a visit scheduled and you want to reiterate that to them. We usually say, I have your visit scheduled for Friday at 1 p.m. with Dr. Erica. And then I say, I'll be sending you a confirmation email. So I kind of outline what their next steps are. If they don't have a visit scheduled, if they just talked through things with you, it's also important to say, we don't have anything scheduled yet. I'll wait for you to call me. That's important because, and I don't know if you've ever had this experience in your clinic, but we have had experiences where the client talks with us and goes through a lot and talks about some potential days or times, and they think that they have it scheduled. It's just there's so much going on, but they didn't actually confirm that they scheduled it. And so we try to always end our calls, with what the result of that call is so the client knows. If you have a cancellation policy, definitely communicate that to them, especially for end of life visits. It can be a roller coaster. The pet might feel better and the client cancels, or maybe the pet passed away overnight. So make sure the client knows how to reach you and what that policy might be. Make referrals when necessary. So this is so helpful even for staff to know that if we can't help, we at least have somewhere where we can direct someone to. We try to never leave clients empty-handed. So having that list of referrals is really helpful, and it gives your team a better way to say no. And then before you hang up with the client, make sure to reiterate your empathy and just really close the call compassionately. So remind them that you're thinking of them, remind them that you're there. They can call. I usually remind them what our hours are, or let them know that if they leave a voicemail after hours, we'll call them right back in the morning. So I just kind of make sure they know how to reach us and that we're there and that we're thinking about them. So these are hard calls, especially in a clinic when there's a lot going on and it's busy, and you might not be used to having these calls. So it's really important to just sort of debrief after that. Even if your debrief is just a big deep breath before you move on to the next phone call, that's better than nothing. I know we don't all have time to take a 5-minute walk after every phone call. In a perfect world, we would, but I know that's not reality. So having a moment to just take a deep breath, walk, get a glass of water, anything to kind of reset before your next call is helpful. And really think about, for you as a person, what would make sense for you to debrief. Some people do need to just get up and move their body for a second and sit back down and reset. Some people like to turn to their coworker and just, quickly tell them about the call. All of those are okay, and everything is different for each person. But it is good to know how to debrief either with a buddy or by yourself. So just really thinking to yourself, it doesn't have to be anything formal, but just kind of reflecting quickly, what went well, what didn't go well, what do I feel awkward about, what do I wish I would have said, do I feel stressed about my call? If so, what could be causing that? Just really kind of thinking about how it went and how you're feeling about it. Every time you do that, your next call will feel a little bit better, and you'll be able to kind of use some things that you're learning each time. If the calls don't feel like they're always going smoothly, it's especially important to do this. And this is a good thing to do, with a coworker too. The other thing that is important is just empathizing on some level with the client and where they're coming from, especially if the call didn't go smoothly or if they weren't, particularly kind back to you. It's really helpful to just acknowledge, is there anything about what the client was saying that I can empathize with? Maybe not agree with, but I can understand where they're coming from. That's really important. We'll talk a little bit more about that coming up here, but everything else, we just let it go. I try to think of it as like a wet rag, and afterwards, after the experience, you just wring everything out that you can use, that you can get rid of, and then you get rid of the dirty, wet rag. And so having that visualization helps me just sort of remember there are some things I can use from this, everything else I'm going to let go. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to acknowledge a couple of common challenges and opportunities. These are things that we, of course, run into here at Minnesota Pets, but these are some things that I thought would be especially relevant for clinics as well. So saying no and describing limitations, talking with angry or highly insistent clients, trying to fit these calls in while you're busy in the clinic, and then a lack of privacy that you might have for difficult conversations. So saying no and describing limitations, I would say this is the number one thing that our team struggles with. This is something that really can cause a lot of burnout and compassion fatigue. So having a conversation with your team or just reflecting on it is really helpful so that you kind of feel like you're prepared and you're processing it and maybe reducing the discomfort that comes with it. So if you're not able to help a client, it's always a good idea to apologize, not necessarily, for anything that you've done wrong, because you may not have done anything wrong at all, but you're sorry that they're in that position. And so you can say, I'm so sorry that this is happening, or I wish things were different, and then keep it simple. One example of this would be we've had recently some clients who kind of push back on our COVID protocols about wearing masks or maintaining distance because they've had their first vaccination shot or maybe both of them, and so they don't want to wear a mask. And that's really difficult because we don't really want to get into the science and why we still require it, and it turns into a totally different type of conversation. So we just really keep it simple and we say, I know, I wish that it wasn't like this. This timing is so difficult. I'm sorry. We require masks, and that's just the CDC recommendation, so we have to follow it. And then we give them an option. We can give you a referral, you can call your clinic and see what they're requiring. Usually it's about the same, but we try to give them those options. So we empathize, we apologize, we keep it simple, and then we align with them, especially when it comes to COVID. I think this is something that we can do, to say, I know this is really hard. I wish it wasn't like this. Like, we agree this isn't how we want it to go. And so to convey that to them, I think can really help. You're not the bad guy. You're in this with them. So I think it's important to say things that remind them of that in, an appropriate and gentle way. It's also helpful to just clearly state what you can do for them. So we tell them what we can't do for them. We make that boundary clear, that limitation, clear to them. And then we pivot and explain what we can do. So for example, we might not be able to, at a clinic, let more than one person inside, but we can help Buddy today with euthanasia if he needs help. And so saying what the boundary is and then letting them know what you can do, and then immediately moving into outlining their options for them. So giving them some options does help us say no. So for example, I'm so sorry we don't have an opening today. Here are your options. You can schedule for next Tuesday when we have something open. I can give you a referral for another practice, that might be able to help, or you can continue to monitor Buddy and give us a call in the coming days with your decision. So kind of outlining those options for them. So I have some examples here. This, of course, there are so many opportunities to do this because there are a lot of reasons sometimes why we can't help a client. They might not be a good fit for us. They might not be in our service area. And so there are ways that you can kind of practice this, but having options for them helps a lot. So with angry or insistent clients, again, clear, direct information. We don't want to, give them any reason to think that we might be able to budge on things we can't budge, or, we'll check with the doctor and, make sure. If we know the answer is no, it's just really fair to the client and to yourself to let them know right away. If we let them think there might be some wiggle room, we're just kind of drawing out that pain of having to then call them again and say, I checked and we can't help. And so just that clear, direct information, apologize and align. Those are the important things to do right away. And then use positive language to reframe the options. So this is something our team talked a lot about at the beginning of COVID. So we kind of at first were just like, I'm so sorry, we can only have 2 people present. So for Minnesota Pets, we could only have 2 people present. So we would say, I'm just so sorry. And we would sort of get wrapped up in that and just really feel bad that we were requiring that. And I think spending too much time on that, rather than remembering or thinking to ourselves, we only allow 2 people present, but we're able to come to your home and help you with this during a pandemic. And so reframing, whether it's something that you say or if it's just something that you think, is really helpful. I'm sorry, we're booked, we can't fit you in. Instead of that, think, we can't help you with an appointment, but I am, a kind person who understands, and I'm supporting you over the phone, and I'm giving you referrals and options. So of course, that's not something we say outright to clients, but it's something we know and we think, and that helps us. Every time we have an angry client or an insistent client, really circle back to the options they have available and remember that you're not responsible for their decision or their outcome. It's not your fault that they're in the situation they're in. Whatever they choose to do, has nothing to do with you. It's important to remind yourself of that. You're not a part of that for the client. You can help them and support them and give them their options, but you're not ultimately responsible for their outcome. It's really, really important to remind yourself of that and remind each other on your team so that you can kind of compassionately detach from those calls and those clients. Otherwise, carrying that with you day after day is really heavy. And then, like I mentioned, having a list of referrals ready. So I have Leslie Knope here on the screen, and I love this quote. It says, when I hear when I'm being yelled at are people caring loudly at me. This is an example, one of my favorite examples of just kind of having a strengths-based approach. So you hang up the phone with an angry client, they weren't super kind to you, you didn't get very far with them, you hang up and you just don't feel good about how it went and how you were treated. It's okay to acknowledge that and to feel bad. There's nothing wrong with feeling bad about that. I absolutely would too, but also kind of remembering, this client is in a hard situation. They clearly love their pet so much that they're feeling, out of control. They don't have great options. They're in a pandemic. They're going through this. They love their pet so much that they're yelling to a nice person on the phone. That's a lot of love for their pet. And so I know it feels sort of unnatural. And every time I say something like this in a presentation, I always think, I can't see anyone's faces, but I feel like people are probably like, that is so insincere, or that would take a lot of effort. But I can promise you that forcing yourself to think that way or helping your coworkers think that way, it does become habit and it sort of happens more naturally over time. So it is really an important part of your self-care, and doing this for each other is really helpful. When you're in a clinic and you're really busy, you have no privacy. Here at DVM Center, we were so busy this summer during COVID, we could barely keep up with our phone calls, and we had more voicemails than we would have liked. We had clients on hold longer than we would have wanted. You're just doing your best. This year is difficult, and even if we weren't in a pandemic, we're still doing our best for our clients. And so it's important to know that these things are sometimes out of our control, and we can only do our best with what we have. With that being said, there might be some tweaks that you can make, and maybe they're things that you've thought about, or maybe they're not possible, or maybe you just haven't considered some of these things before. But these are just a few things I wanted to mention in case they're possible at your clinic. If you have someone that really could use some support and needs to talk, and you cannot talk right now, you're about to go on an appointment, or the phone is ringing off the hook, you have a bunch of people on hold, talk to the client and ask them if you could call them back even in a couple hours when your second receptionist comes in, or as soon as things settle down, can you give them a call back? And to say, like, I really want to be able to help and spend some time talking with you about this. Clients will feel like that's okay. They will be okay with having to wait a little while. So if that's possible, that's something to think about. Set time expectations early. This is especially helpful if you know you won't have time for a long conversation and you have an inkling that it could be a long conversation. Right away, say something like, I'm so glad that you called. This is really important. I actually have about 10 minutes right now, so let's talk through this. So you're right away saying, I have 10 minutes, which in the grand scheme of things, it might not be that much time, but you're kind of framing it as like, wow, I have 10 minutes. I'm so glad you caught me right now. Let's talk through this. And so you're letting them know, and that makes it easier so that 10 minutes later, you can say, well, unfortunately, I'm out of time. And then you can have a plan for follow-up or some homework for them. If you have anyone on your team who would like to be the go-to person for end-of-life calls, see if that person would mind, handling some of these follow-ups, or if there's a block of time, each week where they can just kind of check in with clients, or at the end of that visit. Some people on the team really enjoy this, and we know that because our team happens to be made up of these people, and often our people on our team did work in clinics previously, and they often come to us and they say, yes, this was what I like to do at my clinic. So there's a chance that someone at your clinic really does like to have these conversations and might be really skilled at it. So have them be a go-to person, so that they can do something that they enjoy and are good at, and it kind of evens things out and delegates. If things are tricky with privacy and, kind of being present with the client because there's so much going on at the front desk, or if it feels sort of embarrassing to have conversations like this when other people can overhear you, which I completely understand, think about whether there are ways you can step away from the front desk to have this phone call for a couple of minutes. If you have wireless headsets, if there's an old cell phone that you can have be a phone that you call clients back from so that you can go in another room, or if there's a phone in an exam room that's not being used, there are some ways that you might be able to have some privacy. But also at the end of the day, remember that if your coworkers can't hear you, that's a perfect opportunity to debrief with them because they kind of know the phone call that you just had. So I totally understand these calls feeling a little, sensitive to have in front of coworkers. So giving that some thought. And then remember that the longer the phone call does not necessarily mean the better the phone call. It really is quality over quantity. And so I wanted to point that out because I think a lot of people assume, well, if I'm having an end of life call, it's got to be about 20 minutes, I'm sure, to get through everything. And that's just, it doesn't have to be the case. Of course, if you have the time and the client needs it, we'll spend as much time with clients on the phone as they need. But it's really common, I have a good phone call, I get everything I need, we talk through some things, and I hang up and I look and it was only a 6-minute phone call. And so really, over time, you kind of build your scripts, you can kind of be more efficient, you convey empathy in a very efficient and compassionate and sincere way. And those phone calls certainly can stay, somewhat short. So a couple of things, I know I went through everything really quickly, and I see in the chat that Sarah is reminding everyone that the presentation will be available as a recording if you need to look back through anything. But just a couple of things, to take away or next steps. Remember that the work you do off the phone prepares you for better phone calls. So review your website for those must-haves, and then try to set aside some time to focus on phone calls. I don't know if your practice has ever really specifically thought about phone calls or end of life calls. If you haven't, it's worth, having a little task force or a brainstorming session. If you have a client survey, maybe ask a question about the phone call. At DVM Center, sometimes we call them pain points, and we encourage our team to just let us know if there's a pain point. And it can be as simple as, when I'm on the screen talking to clients, I have to leave and open up this document to get the answer. And then, we think about how we can get that information right in the intake form. And so even the smallest things make those go a little bit smoother. We've even offered, gift cards to people on our team for a cup of coffee for whoever has the list of pain points that we can use. So it's something to really encourage and ask your employees to do. And then try to encourage, of course, a culture of team support and debriefing. Really try to normalize, especially if you're in a leadership position, try to normalize, debriefing and taking a breath after a call and acknowledging, if you hear your coworker having a tough call, acknowledge that and, see if they need anything. That's really important. It's just important for us to know these calls are not easy, and a lot of us don't have specific training around this. So really, you're all, doing your best and doing a great job for clients. And hopefully some of these things were helpful. And I put my email address in here too. If your team needs any individualized help or would like, some consulting on this, just let us know. We offer that through DVM Center, so you can always reach out about this. So I'll have that available, and it looks like we were right on time, but if anyone has any quick questions, we can certainly take those.
Lots of thank yous coming through. Thank you, Kristi. That was fantastic. And thank you to everybody for joining us. We'll stay on for another minute or two. If you have any questions, go ahead and use the chat box. Otherwise, I will send out the CE certificates this afternoon and also add a link to our next webinar, which will be February 25th, and that is how to be a great boss.
And Sarah, did you see that